Well, greetings and salutations, everyone. I hope everyone is still doing well on this Labor Day, and welcome to tonight's second half. Before we jump into it, a couple links. As many of you know, I rely on Patreon, PayPal, channel membership, and the merch to help the channel to continue to grow and go. Links to Patreon, PayPal, and channel membership is in the description below. The merch displayed directly under the video. Also, Dogman Frightening Encounters, Volume 1 through 3, the audiobook versions. They were written and researched by Tom Lyons, narrated and produced by me, Jeff Nadolny. Those audiobooks are available on Audible, Amazon, and iTunes, links to which are also in the description as well. And finally, last but definitely not least, if you'd really like to help support the channel to continue to grow and go, simply subscribe. It does not cost you a cent. Click that like button, takes half a second. If you don't want to miss out on any of the informative uploads I put out daily, click that bell icon, and folks, please leave a comment. Why? Well, because all of these things really do help the channel to continue to grow and go. And yes, folks, they definitely do matter. Now, everyone, I have taken far too much of your time. Let's jump in to tonight's second half. Shall we? So, Dogman Frightening Encounters, Volume 1 through 3, the audiobooks that I was fortunate enough to narrate and produce. Tom Lyons wrote and researched them. I decided to take an experience out of each book and share them with you. If you like what you hear, the links to those audiobooks are in the description. But I wanted to share with you guys a couple of encounters. Like I said, one out of each Dogman Frightening Encounters. Let's get into it. Dogman Frightening Encounters, Volume 1. My encounter took place years ago, and it now amazes me that I hadn't even taken the time to write it down before. It truly works like therapy, just as so many people have claimed. The year was 1989, and I was living on the outskirts of Greensboro, North Carolina. I had 3 dogs living with me at the time. 1 black Labrador, 1 yellow Labrador, and 1 German Shepherd mix, all of which were females. The trio of dogs were excellent for the wooded environment that I resided in at the time. They were extremely intelligent and in touch with the natural habitat. None of them was the type to bark for no reason. When they did sound the alarms, it was always because predators were nearby. Let me tell you, nothing intimidated them. At least, that's what I once thought. I'd been living in that home for over 2 years when I was mysteriously woken by all the dogs whimpering at once. All 3 of them slept near the foot of my bed, and the behavior was so unusual that I remember questioning whether I was in a dream state. The German Shepherd Blair was doing circles near my bedroom door. It was hard to tell if she wanted to investigate something or if she wanted to escape the bedroom for whatever reason. I tried to hush them for quite some time without any success. None of them were looking toward either of my bedroom windows, so it was more like they had smelled something or heard something that my senses didn't pick up on. Eventually, I became so restless that I let Blair walk out of the room, hoping to get some clue as to what had stirred them up. My other dogs, Greta and Mama, stayed put in my room, continuing their soft whimpers. I grabbed a glass of water while I watched Blair trot in circles around my living room coffee table. I did notice that she was occasionally glancing up toward the windows, but it was apparent that she couldn't see anything out of the ordinary. After a few moments of watching the same thing, I asked Blair back into the bedroom and allowed the 3 dogs to jump up on the bed with me. That was something I so rarely did, but I couldn't think of anything else to get them to calm down. There was something about the 4 of us being huddled together that did help them calm down. For the next couple of weeks, everything in life proceeded as normal. It got to the point where I was able to brush off that strange behavior. I guess I was just convinced myself that one of them was overreacting, and it caused the others to become concerned for no reason. Then I woke up to the same thing. This time the trio seemed even more worked up than the last time. I'm one of those folks who are woken up very easily and find it very challenging to fall back to sleep. Unfortunately, this pattern turned into a regular thing after the second incident, without any indication as to what was getting the dogs so worked up. Even though I didn't have much money to spend on that sort of thing, I brought the three of them to get examined by the vet. I was starting to come to a variety of strange theories, one of them being that I might have a terminal illness, and they could somehow smell it. You hear about all the sort of weird things like that. So I became very open-minded about what was bothering them so much. After the vet ran tests on all three of the dogs and couldn't find anything wrong with them, I decided to see my physician for the first time in years. I just wanted to squash all of those worries. My doctor would end up revealing to me that I was pretty much as healthy as one could get at the age of 44. Even though I was relieved to learn that we were all physically okay, it didn't solve the nighttime routine. It had gotten so bad that I was losing hours of sleep almost every night. It was badly affecting my schedule, and I wasn't getting nearly as much work done on the job. I had searched my yard multiple times without finding any evidence of intruders or rare animals, but there was one day when I came home from work at lunchtime to make a sandwich, and I noticed a few strange-looking tracks in the dirt by my driveway, kind of similar to what Tom found before his initial Bigfoot encounter. The only conclusion that could come to me at the time was that the tracks belonged to some large wolf, but the toes were much larger than any wild dog I knew existed. Additionally, I knew my dogs wouldn't have been that intimidated by a rogue wolf. Together, the three of them were confident that they could take on any intrusive wild animal. It was that same night that my dogs woke me up again. Even though I was weirded out by the tracks I had found earlier that day, I just couldn't take it anymore. I went outside with a flashlight, and my dogs were essentially screaming. It was as if they were begging me to come back inside. When I closed the door behind me, I could hear them whimpering louder than ever before. They were super concerned about my well-being. I started pointing the flashlight near the trees, scanning the area for any movement. I remember how still everything felt at that moment. It was as if time itself had stopped. As I neared the edge of the trees, my heart started to beat extremely fast, and I was overcome by this feeling that I shouldn't be out there. My instincts were telling me that I should have listened to my dogs. It was as I was turning around, about to head back inside, that the shine from my flashlight landed on a figure that was more than halfway cloaked by a hanging pine tree. But I could see enough to know that it was looking directly at me. Suddenly I caught sight of this massive head as it steadily ducked beneath the branch. The thing was standing on two legs, but from what I could see of the head, it reminded me so much of my own German Shepherd, only much larger, and its face was considerably wider. The creature was multiple shades of dark brown and black, and was completely covered in fur. The branch, which it lowered its head below, was considerably high, making it as clear as day that this thing was no shorty. I don't think it was standing up straight, but I'm going to throw it out there that I think it was around 8 feet tall. I could see one of its hands, and I say hand because it didn't look like a paw. I could see a long, opposable thumb. All of the fingers had long nails extending from them. I wanted to turn and run from this thing, but there was no question that it would be able to tackle me before I could get to the door. It truly felt as though I was at this thing's mercy. I had been so devastated by the sighting of this creature that I hadn't even noticed my dogs were now barking louder than ever and clawing at the front door. I think it's because they wanted to protect me and were very aware of what stood only yards away from me. The creature continued to hunch its head beneath the branch and then bring it up. It would change its position every few seconds while keeping the rest of its body completely still. I'm not even totally sure that it knew I could see it while it stood behind the tree. Then a sigh of relief came over me as I watched the creature swiftly turn and head back into the woods. As soon as I could no longer see it, that's when I did a 180 and sprinted toward my front door. It felt as though I was running in slow motion, like I could not get inside fast enough. Thankfully, I made it to the door and slammed it closed behind me. When I walked over to the window to close the blinds, that's when I came face to face with the creature. It was standing inches away from the glass, its shoulders hunched so that its head was level with mine. You're going to think this sounds insane, but those eyes were purely human. It is because of this experience that I now do not doubt that werewolves, lichens, and however you want to refer to them, are as real as ever. It didn't take long to realize that all three of my dogs had left the room. I guess seeing the creature that up close crossed the line, and they were too intimidated to let out another peep, even if it was to warn me, their master. I always wonder what my dogs thought of the creature. Do they know the truth about what it was? Did they see it as some demonic entity or just another animal that happens to be much more powerful? If my theory is correct, could they tell that the creature had human DNA? That is something that has always intrigued me. There's no question that dogs possess senses that are superior to ours. So I badly wish I could have asked my dogs for their analysis of the creature that had visited us that night. I remember how the creature's breath quickly began fogging up the glass. It was amazing to me how I never heard it take a single step while it moved toward the house. Maybe I was just too scared to pay any attention at the time, but if these creatures are as stealthy as ninjas, that makes their existence all the more terrifying. It continued to stare at me as I slowly backed away from the window. I backed around the corner and into the kitchen and grabbed the largest butcher knife I had, waited a few minutes, then peeked around the corner. I could see nothing through the window. I'm not sure how long I waited, but I stood there, leaning against the counter, pretty much waiting for any sign of noise. All is silent. Eventually, my dogs trotted out from hiding, and I took that as a sign the creature had vacated the area. My dogs and I stayed up for the remainder of the night, and we went to get a motel room the following night. I ended up renting an apartment on a month-to-month basis and realized I was too frightened to stay another night at my house. I ended up selling the house to a burly fellow who was really into deer hunting. I assumed that he had seen some weird things in the woods, so I didn't hesitate to tell him about my encounter. He claimed he had never seen anything that unusual. However, he had heard many strange noises that he couldn't pinpoint to any known animal. My story didn't deter him from making the purchase. If anything, it seemed to excite him, and might have even persuaded him to seal the deal. I always told myself I was going to follow up with the purchaser as to whether he had seen the werewolf-like creature, but I never got around to it. I actually sent a letter to my old address not too many years ago, simply asking if the fellow still lived there, but I never received a response, so I never took it any further. I don't think I'll ever know for sure what I encountered while living at my old property, but what I do know for sure is that there are so many truths out there that are beyond our wild imaginations. Dogman Frightening Encounters, Volume 2. If you've ever been to Marietta, Ohio, perhaps you'd agree that it has a charming but ghostly feel to it. My encounter with the Dogman happened while I was visiting my old college girlfriend back in 2006. We're both from Ohio and met while studying at the Great Ohio State University. My girlfriend, who I will give the name Lauren, knew that I was obsessed with all outdoor activities, so she surprised me with a kayaking trip that was meant to last a few hours. The day got off to a great start. Things like kayaking always got me into my best possible mood. It was amazing how quickly things could turn dark. I don't think we had even been kayaking for an hour when suddenly we spotted a man in uniform who was standing alongside the river and awaiting us to get closer so that he could speak to us. He waved us down, so it was immediately evident that whatever he had to say was important. By the time we paddled close enough to him, I could see around the bend that there were armed professionals. At first, it looked to me like the SWAT team had been called over to respond to an emergency of some kind. As I continued to observe the man, I soon realized they were not police officers, but rather military personnel. I was so distracted by the activity that I only gathered bits and pieces of what the forest ranger was saying to us. He said that he would call for someone with a trailer to pick us and the kayaks up, since he wasn't legally allowing us to go any further. He also made it very clear that he wasn't permitted to reveal any of the details to us. It was while Lauren and I had begun to drag the kayaks out of the water that we heard the hair-raising growl, followed by gunfire. The only thing that I could assume at the time was that the men had been summoned to track down an aggressive mountain lion or black bear. However, my assumption that they were dealing with an ordinary animal would soon be put to rest. Out of nowhere, an extremely tall and hairy figure came running around the riverbank and was hobbling straight toward where we were standing. When looking back on it, something that is a tad humorous was how the ranger ran into the water before instructing us on what to do. Naturally, we did the same as him, fully immersing ourselves into the cool water. Although the Dogman eyed us as it hobbled onward, it was as if it knew it had no time for us. Of course, I'm so grateful for that, because that thing was fully capable of being a killing machine. I can't imagine any living thing standing a chance at surviving if this creature designated it as prey. I've heard some people say that a Bigfoot might be able to hold its own against one of these things, but I've never seen one, so it's hard to imagine anything giving a Dogman a run for its money. Tom asked me to provide a detailed description of what the creature looked like, and I think the best way of doing that would be to tell you to go online and look up the lichens from the Underworld film series. This thing was just as muscular as those creatures, if not more so. I'm also going to go ahead and say I believe it was taller than any of the creatures in those movies. I hope that whatever I saw was a full-grown adult, because if not, the idea that any land predator could grow larger chills me to the core. I feel like something of that size could take down an African elephant single-handedly. I believe that the only reason the creature didn't kill every single one of those military men was that it was likely drugged up. I could tell by its body language that this was no unintelligent organism. It wasn't long before the men came around the corner and started firing at the creature. There was no question that they wanted to prevent any more civilians from seeing the thing. I'm not sure whether any bullets penetrated the creature, since it continued to hobble at high speed in the other direction. Just after the creature disappeared from our sights, a black helicopter entered the area and hovered above the nearby woods that the creature had likely entered. Even though the ranger seemed to be almost as shocked by all of this as we were, he warned us that we were going to sign a confidentiality agreement form before he'd permit us to leave the area. He was right. Before the van came to pick us up, along with the kayaks, a man in military fatigue brought out a binder from their vehicle that contained a stack of paper. It was a black binder that looked like it had been around for quite some time. I couldn't help but wonder how many signatures it had inside. Was this ordeal more of a common thing than I would have thought? It all happened so fast that it's hard to give it some storybook ending. They had all of our information, and we were expected to remain quiet about it. Lauren is now my wife, and we have told various close friends throughout the years, at least the ones who we suspected would be interested. But I get the feeling a few of them believe us. I think they believe that something out of the ordinary happened, but it was likely a bear that we had mistaken for some mythical beast. Just as with so many other reports I have read, the experience gave birth to a new hobby for both Lauren and myself. We've calmed down a little bit since then, but there was a time when we were reading, listening to, and watching every piece of Dogman-related content we could get our hands on. When you realize there is so much more to the existence than you had originally thought, it tends to make life more interesting than it was. At least, that's how it was for Lauren and myself. However, I can imagine it being suffocating if you are the only one out of everyone you know who has had an encounter with cryptid. There is no question that it was therapeutic for both us to have someone so close to review the event with. I do believe that the whole thing brought us closer, and you wouldn't believe how deep some of the discussions get between us. It feels like we are immersed in this ongoing mystery that will likely never get solved. Dogman Frightening Encounters, Volume 3. Hello to all of you. My name is Marlene, and I was visited by something strange back in the early 2000s. It's something I still have trouble accepting. It is reality. I was in my early 40s when I made the impulsive decision to move to a rental property in Stanley, Idaho. I had lived outside of St. Louis, Missouri my whole life, and a devastating event, one that I'd rather not go into detail on, prompted me to escape to somewhere far, far away. The chances are good that you've never heard of Stanley. It's an extremely low-key town with one of the smallest populations out there. I never planned on permanently settling down there, but the idea of being around as few people as possible was very appealing to me at this point in my life. I've always been passionate when it comes to writing poetry, so the thought of doing that alone in the mountains was very romantic. It's probably pointless to say that I wasn't expecting to undergo a nightmare. I was thrilled when I found out that I could rent this charming little cabin along a beautiful river. With nothing but mountains in the background, the view was breathtaking, and the sound of the steady flow of river was so very healing for my distraught mind. There was not a neighbor in sight. Normally, I would have recommended relocating to this type of desolate environment while coping with trauma, but that was before I learned what lurks in places like that. The payoff can be huge, but you do put yourself in danger. I hadn't even been there for a week when I was awoken one night by the sound of something scratching at one of the windows in my bedroom. It wasn't an aggressive scratch, it was slow and steady. A bit like nails on a chalkboard. Since I was in the middle of nowhere, I hadn't been using blinds, but that particular window was positioned in a way where I wasn't able to see through it from my bed. And yes, I wasn't brave enough to step out of bed to get a better look. I've always been a rational person, so I assumed that it had to be a bird or something small like that. Still, something warned me to stay put under the covers and let it be. The scratching noise continued for a minute or two, and I eventually dismissed it and fell asleep. The next morning, I was walking around the property and decided to get a look at the outside of the window, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. There were a series of streaks in the glass, but it was easy to see that the windows were old and weathered. As far as I could tell, nothing strange took place for the next few nights. Since I've never been one to go to sleep too late, it was likely around 10 o'clock that I was in bed and was reading a novel when I heard another peculiar noise taking place near the outside of the window. Though I couldn't make out what was happening, it sounded like a decent-sized animal was out of breath and panting somewhere on the lawn. The breathing had a deep pitch, but I wasn't too educated in wildlife, so I had no real clue what to attribute it to. You might make fun of me for this, but again, I was too afraid to get out from under the sheets to identify the noise. The following morning, with coffee in hand, I walked around the house looking for any clues, mainly droppings. As I neared the outside of the bedroom window, I immediately noticed the mess. A lot of dirt that ran alongside the outer wall had been dug up and tossed all over the lawn. It was as if something was trying to get underneath or inside of the house. Judging by the gashes in the soil, it looked like either a gardening tool or a very wide hand with long fingers had been used to shovel it. I'm confident that you'd agree that both of those possibilities are exceptionally creepy. There was a part of me that was inclined to pack up and leave the area, but I had already paid for an entire month of rent, and money was in no way disposable for me. Also, the last thing I wanted was to head back home. Mentally, I was less willing to do that than to deal with whoever or whatever was stalking the property. It was the very next evening that I was working on my poetry when I again heard the strange noise. My bedroom door was ajar, and I could hear the sound faintly emanating from the outer wall, just like during the previous night. The fact that it was still light outside must have given me a boost of confidence, because I didn't hesitate to go and check out the scene. When I peered out of the glass, I instantly froze with fear. This large, hairy thing was hunched over and using these unbelievably large hands to dig at the soil near the bedroom window. The noise made it apparent that it was scraping at the wall of the house and attempting to get inside the dwelling. After observing the beast for a few moments, it suddenly stopped what it was doing and began sniffing the air. The large nostrils at the end of the long snout rapidly opened and closed as it analyzed whatever scent had caught its attention. It was already fully aware that I was on the other side of the wall. Before it could even look up at me, the creature began to growl in this very strange way. Its head bobbled back and forth while it remained crouched over. Truly, it felt like I was looking at something of alien origin. I've noticed that a lot of people believe these Dogman creatures are something straight out of hell. Maybe it's because I'm an atheist that I see it a bit differently. All I can say with true confidence is that these rare things are otherworldly. It feels like they don't belong in the same environment as humans. As I said, I was too frightened to move at that moment, so I continued to examine this creature against my will. The growl was more like a purr that I could feel internally. I wondered if the noise could be a defense mechanism that they either use to deter unwanted visitors or to devastate their prey before they make the kill. In any case, it was no good for me. For some reason, I was determined to avoid eye contact, and I suddenly found myself in the kitchen area. It felt as though the creature had managed to disorient me enough to the point where I don't even remember making my way into the other room. Anyhow, it was clear that it wanted to make its way inside the house, but I couldn't understand why. It didn't just use one of the windows. The creature was so large that it could have so easily broken the glass of any window and stepped inside. It'd be one thing if the windows were too small, but the cabin had unusually large windows, surely to take advantage of the expansive views that surrounded the place. It was then that it occurred to me I hadn't yet checked out the basement. Could it have wanted to get in there for whatever reason? Although the basement door wasn't locked, there was a sign on the doorknob that read private. I disregarded it because if there was something down there that attracted the strange creature, I wanted to get rid of it. The animal was far too intimidating to deal with, and I was desperate for it not to ruin my time of healing. After flipping on the light switch and slowly making my way down the steps, I immediately noticed an odd stench in the air. It was one that was unfamiliar to my senses. Then I laid eyes on rows of tables, all of which were cluttered with taxidermy artwork. Even though I respect the complexity of the art form, it's something that I've always found a tad creepy. I realized it was merely my mind playing tricks on me, but it felt as if every one of those stuffed critters were staring at me, those marble eyes analyzing and judging me. I'll never forget how there was this buck with a pair of crows standing on its antlers, each of them presenting a hollow stare. There was also a variety of animals that I didn't initially recognize. One of them, I'd later learn, was a wolverine. Up till that point in my life, I think I'd only seen cartoon renditions of them. I had no idea how menacing they can look in the flesh. I suppose that's part of why they have the reputation for having a bad temper. Suddenly I was startled by the sound of scratching coming from the ground level. Things then began to make little more sense. The odor of the basement was so potent that it must have found its way to the nostrils of the large dog-like creature. That was when I began to feel like I had made my way to the wrong rental property. I remember feeling angry at that moment, like, how would anyone in their right mind think it's a good idea to promote their rental property with a large predator roaming the grounds? Did they not find it intimidating that this thing was trying to make its way inside? What if I had been walking around the land when it decided to come around? That whole idea was just so difficult for me to comprehend. It seemed so unbelievably irresponsible. After making my way up the stairs, I immediately grabbed the telephone and dialed the number of the company that rented the house to me. Though I didn't have the direct number for the owner of the home, I needed to at least vent to someone. It was as the employee answered the phone that I realized I had little clue of how to emphasize the strangeness of the situation. I told them that a large animal was attempting to dig its way into the house, and that I no longer feel safe there. They probably thought I was a bit of a lunatic, but they did offer me a full refund. Unfortunately, that didn't do very much to make me feel safe in the current situation. The scratching was lasting longer this time, making me feel that the animal was intent on making its all the way in. And I wondered if it was because I was down there. After quietly making my way up the steps, I could still hear the sound of its breaths as it continued scratching away. It was by far the most frightened I've ever been in my entire life. Nothing can even come close. With the rental company employee still on the line, I asked if they could send someone by. Again, they seemed perplexed as to how they should appropriately proceed, but they did as I asked and said they'd get someone to come and check things out. Surely the employee could hear the fear in my voice and wanted to help, but had never dealt with anything like that. The whole situation was awkward. By the time I spotted a vehicle pulling into the space where my car was parked, I could still hear the animalistic noises coming from the other side of the small home. I watched from inside as a younger man exited the vehicle and began walking toward the front door. I was hoping that the person over the phone had at least given this guy the heads up that there was a very dangerous animal in the vicinity. But his stride seemed far too casual, completely unguarded. As he raised his fist about to knock, I quickly opened the door and demanded him to step inside. He was a taller, very well-built individual, but I could tell that my demeanor was already giving him the creeps. I bet I made him contemplate a career change as he stepped foot inside of the house. His name was Bruce, and he ended up being extremely polite. It was as I was explaining to him everything that had happened that I realized I no longer heard the sounds of the animal. I guided him into the bedroom and asked him to look outside of the window. His body language immediately conveyed that he saw nothing unusual. Now, here's where things become very puzzling. I was so desperate to prove to this guy that I hadn't lost my mind that I suddenly became brave enough to walk him around the outside of the house. He'd at least be able to see the marks in the soil and on the exterior wall of the house, right? Wrong. It was devastating for me to find that there was nothing there. There was no signs of any kind. It was as if someone or something had come by and cleaned up any evidence that the creature had been around. I'm not going to lie, I almost had a breakdown on the spot. It was the first time in my life that I began to question my sanity, and having a stranger there right next to me made me feel even more uncomfortable. And just like that, I got the feeling that I wasn't dealing with a wild animal. I was dealing with an apparition. I think the guy could tell that I was embarrassed as he awkwardly asked if there was anything else I needed, signaling that he wanted to be on his way. I thanked him for coming out and agreed that I'd call again if I felt in danger. Before he departed, he provided me with the number to my local animal control. Even though I was slightly creeped out by the idea that a ghost had visited me, I at least felt comforted by the idea that it wouldn't be able to harm me. Looking back at it, I don't know why I assumed that was guaranteed. Even if I was dealing with a ghost, who was I to think that I knew anything about the science behind all that stuff? The reality was that I knew nothing, and I was merely trying to comfort myself so that I'd be able to continue living in that cabin in peace. Once night rolled around, everything remained quiet and calm, which did a lot to help my state of mind. I was able to read a book in peace and had a very restful sleep. That experience boosted my confidence and reaffirmed the idea that I had made the right choice by deciding to stay out there. I want to say it was about 4 or 5 nights that everything felt normal. Then things changed. It was after 3 in the morning when I awoke to what sounded like footsteps coming from the common room and kitchen. It was like someone or something was pacing between the 2 rooms. Part of me wanted to yell at whoever was out there to go away, but another part of me warned that would be a very bad idea. So I continued to lie there, frozen from fear, desperately hoping that whoever or whatever was outside of the room would just go away. My bedroom door was closed, but there were no locks on any of the doors inside from the main entrance and the basement. I was so afraid that I was going to hear the sound of the bedroom doorknob turning. Eventually, after a few moments, all of the noise seemed to stop, and I was left there wide awake and wondering who the hell had been in there. Were they still out there and refraining from making any noise? I'm not sure how, but I did manage to fall back to sleep. Then, out of nowhere, I suddenly woke to something you'll have difficult time believing. I almost didn't want to tell this part, as I felt it might discredit my story, but Tom convinced me otherwise. I felt as though I was going to have a heart attack. I couldn't breathe. I helplessly watched as the large dog-like beast paced back and forth around my bed frame. Its head swung like a pendulum as it stared toward the ground. Whatever this thing was, it seemed so anxious. It was like I could feel anxiety radiating from it. Its diaphragm was rapidly inhaling and exhaling while it made this very sickly panting noise. In some ways, I felt bad for the creature, although I can't be sure why. But mostly, I just wanted for it to go away. Even with it pacing around the room on all fours, I could tell that the hump of this back would be level with my chest if I were to stand next to it. To say the thing was huge was putting it lightly. I've never felt so small and vulnerable in my life. It wasn't long before my nostrils crinkled from a very unpleasant smell, unlike anything I had ever experienced before. The creature paced for such a long period that I eventually began to mutter the words, "Can I help you?" But I was viciously interrupted before I could finish my sentence. The entity lunged toward the bed, as if it were about to pounce, but halted a few feet away from my face. That was when I experienced the smell and the heat of its breath. If I wasn't so terrified, I'm certain I would have hurled all over the bed sheets. Of course, I had been very frightened before, but this was the first time I felt genuinely unwelcome. It felt clear that the spirit was demanding that I leave the property and never return. Suddenly, whatever the thing was, it seemed as though it possessed much greater intelligence than any animal I knew to exist. Its emotions seemed almost human. The bedroom was so dark, but while I stared at the intense face of this entity, I was convinced the eye sockets were hollow. Maybe it had very dark eyes or something, but that is the visual. I've stamped it in my mind. Suddenly the creature turned its head and walked out of the bedroom. I was never much a religious person, but I'm pretty sure that was the first time I said a prayer asking that that strange creature never approach me again. There was no way I was going to feel safe in that house, so by the time I was able to move my legs again, I grabbed a few of my precious belongings and ran to my vehicle. While I drove away from that property, I was so worried that I was going to look in the rearview mirror and see the creature in the back seat. It was such a miserable feeling as I drove toward the nearest town, and the drive seemed to last forever. The realization made me look at life from a different angle. I think that we're all so accustomed to our everyday obligations like earning money that we're sheltered from so much of what's going on out there in its existence. Truly, what did I encounter during my stay at that cabin? I seriously doubt I'll ever know. Here's another weird aspect. When I got to the hotel room, I immediately got into the shower. Since I had already bathed earlier that evening, I have no idea why I was so desperate to cleanse myself, but I was. For some reason I felt filthy. I can't help but wonder if it was because the energy of that entity was so putrid that my brain was convinced it had contaminated me or something. That's the only theory I've been able to come up with. I also remember leaning against the shower wall crying. It was the first time I had let out tears after encountering that thing, and boy did they flow. I didn't sleep at all that night, and as soon as I felt it had reached an appropriate hour, I gave the rental office a call and let them know that I had vacated the property. The person to answer the phone was the same young man who had come out and checked on things after I called the last time. After he politely offered to refund the remainder of my pay, he discreetly confessed that it wasn't the first time a renter had fled the property. He explained that now they would be taking careful measures to look into whatever is causing people to vacate the cabin so suddenly. For all I know, he was probably just saying that to sound more sympathetic. I have a feeling that the business cut ties with the owner of the cabin. I so badly yearn for a detailed explanation of what happened to me. Like, if the creature was a spiritual entity, how was I able to smell its breath? Also, I could feel the vibration when it moved about the cabin floor. When ghosts do visit this dimension, do they take on physical characteristics just like everything else? It's one of those things that I almost have to prevent myself from pondering too much, or I start to feel like I'm losing my mind. Additionally, I'm curious as to what the owner of the house was like. That collection of taxidermy in the basement really creeped me out. It gives me the chills just thinking about it. What if the taxidermist had somehow gotten their hands on the body of a dogman and intended to turn it into a piece of art? What if I didn't see eyeballs on the ghost because they had been removed? I might get criticized for these far-fetched theories, and that's just fine. It felt so good to put this stuff into writing. Having to deal with that entity truly helped me realize something, that we know so little about whatever is out there. I completely relate to Tom Lyons when he talks about how it's beneficial to maintain an open mind, otherwise you'll go through life knowing the false reality. That experience scared me from ever returning to desolate locations by myself. Even if I'm hiking or doing some other outdoor activity with a few other people, I tend to get pretty nervous. I wish it wasn't like this, but there's just something about the mountains that makes me feel like they are near. And by they I mean the unknown. Who knows what's watching us when we are out there. And there you have it, folks. Tonight's second half. I hope you enjoyed this as much as I enjoyed sharing it with you. Once again, a experience chosen out of each of those audiobooks, Dogman Frightening Encounters, Volume 1 through 3. I'd like to thank you all for supporting the channel. It is your support that keeps the channel growing and going, and what gives folks like us a chance and a place to share our experiences and theories judgment-free, just simply treated with the respect that we all deserve. Everyone, please stay safe, happy, healthy, and ever vigilant, keeping an eye on our children, pets, family, and friends. These creatures are real. They are out there and dangerous. Share this information with those you love and care about, and it may just help save their lives someday. Until next time, never stop asking questions, never stop searching for the truth, and God bless.